Good morning, and welcome to Teddy Talks for Wednesday, May 27th, 2020. I'm your host, Joe Wiegand, coming to you from Medora, North Dakota, gateway to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, future home of Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Here at Teddy Talks, it's my hope that in going back to things that Theodore Roosevelt said, did, wrote, on this date in his lifetime, stretching from 1858 until 1919, and also then accessing this date in history with some of the characters with whom Theodore Roosevelt interacted, protagonists, antagonists, world figures, that we might know more about Theodore Roosevelt and his times, and then perhaps even to be able to apply some of what he preached from the bully pulpit and some of his examples of taking action to our own lives. So welcome to Teddy Talks for this date. Looking at the week ahead to complete the month of May and to complete our series of Monday through Saturday visits. In the month of June, we'll move to a once-a-week Saturday format while we get very busy here in Medora. Concluding this week, tomorrow, we've got remarks of President Theodore Roosevelt in Idaho. And imagine when we talk about whistle-stop campaigns and you think of the photographs, the images of Theodore Roosevelt on the back of the train and then perhaps visiting with the townsfolk at the train. We're going to go through Idaho tomorrow to Pocatello, Nampa, Glens Ferry, Mountain Home, Boise, and Shoshone. On Friday, May 29th, Theodore Roosevelt, and that's 1903 that Theodore, during his great Western trip, made those visits in Idaho, and then went on the next day to Utah. So Friday, May 29th, commemorating Theodore Roosevelt's visit, May 29th, 1903, he spoke at the Tabernacle in Salt Lake City, the great Tabernacle of the Mormon Church, and again at Ogden, Utah. We'll conclude our programs this week on Saturday, May 30th. Remarks of Governor Theodore Roosevelt at Grant's Tomb and at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, New York, May 30th, 1899. In both cases, I think his remarks are addressed to members of the Grand Army of the Republic. In a way, the American Legion of the day, the veterans organization, caring for the widow and the orphan and the veteran, as Abraham Lincoln had asked us to do at Gettysburg. Today we'll have two brief speeches Theodore Roosevelt made in Montana. He comes back to this theme of justice and law and our country being here for good citizens, regardless of their section, their creed, and their class. Montana having been a site of significant violence in the mining industry. And you might remember we were talking about some of the assassination in Denver of the former governor of Montana. Teddy Talks on May 27th, 2020. We've got some dates in history. The birth in May 27th, 1794, the birth in Staten Island, New York of Cornelius Vanderbilt. This is the Vanderbilt known as the Commodore, the one who really amassed the wealth in railroads and shipping, eventually owning the New York Central Railroad, though a great deal of the wealth was built up in the ferries that carried folks from Staten Island to New York City. He provided the initial gift to found Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. It would be his children who very often would be in the forefront of the Gilded Age. May 27th, 1813, in the War of 1812 in Canada, the American forces capture Fort George. That's in the Niagara Falls region. May 27th, 1818, the birth in Homer, New York of Amelia Jenks Bloomer, an American journalist, women's rights and temperance advocate. In 1851, she actually introduced a couple of leading women's rights advocates, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They would go on to forge an alliance for decades, and it was Bloomer who introduced Stanton to Anthony in Seneca Falls, where Bloomer published The Lily. She was the first female owner and editor of a regular magazine, eventually selling that magazine when she and her husband moved to Council Bluffs, Iowa. Bloomer often wrote about fashion in her magazine, in addition to women's rights. She wrote in her magazine about what she was doing, quote, "It was a needed instrument to spread abroad the truth of a new gospel to woman, and I could not withhold my hand to stay the work I had begun. I saw not the end from the beginning, and dreamed where to my propositions to society would lead me." I mentioned she wrote about costumes, promoting a change in dress standards for women that would be less restrictive in regular activities. She wrote, quote, "The costume of women should be suited to her wants and necessities. It should conduce at once to her health, comfort, and usefulness, and while it should not fail also to conduce to her personal adornment, it should make that end of secondary importance." There was a New England temperance activist, Elizabeth Smith Miller, known as Libby Miller, who had gone and traveled, and she came back and she liked the idea of women's trousers, gathered at the ankles and topped by a short dress, skirt, and vest. She wore the costume, as did the famous actress Fanny Kemble. And she introduced that clothing to Stanton, her cousin, who found it sensible and adopted the garb. Stanton visited Bloomer, who began to wear the costume and promoted it enthusiastically in her magazine. Articles on the clothing trend were picked up in the New York Tribune. More women wore the fashion, which was promptly dubbed the Bloomer costume, or bloomers. And now you know where we get that phrase, bloomers. Amelia Jenks Bloomer tried the fashion briefly and went back to a more traditional garb, but we remember today the birth of Ms. Bloomer. She would die December 30th, 1894 in Council Bluffs, Iowa. On this date, May 27th, 1819, the birth in New York City, New York, of Julia Ward Howe, American poet, known for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. She and her husband visited the White House and Abraham Lincoln in November of 1861. Her friend James Freeman Clarke suggested she write new words to the song John Brown's Body, which the soldiers were singing, and she did so on November 19th. The song was set to William Steffes' already existing music, and Howe's version was first published in the Atlantic Monthly in February of 1862. The opening stanza, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." She would live a long life to the age of 91, dying October 1910 in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. So profound was Julia Ward Howe's influence that Theodore Roosevelt dedicated his 1916 book, Fear God and Take Your Own Part, to Julia Ward Howe, writing, quote, "This book is dedicated to the memory of Julia Ward Howe, because in the vital matters fundamentally affecting the life of the Republic, she was as good a citizen of the Republic as Washington and Lincoln themselves. She was, in the highest sense, a good wife and a good mother. At the same time, she fulfilled her duty to the Commonwealth. She preached that stern and lofty courage of soul which shrinks neither from war nor suffering and hardship and danger. She embodies that trait more essential than any other in the makeup of the men and women of this republic, the valor of righteousness." Theodore Roosevelt on Julia Ward Howe. She was a pacifist, and that would have been an issue on which Theodore Roosevelt and Julia Ward Howe would have had contrary viewpoints. May 27th, 1831, the death of Jedediah Strong Smith. He was born in Tioga County, New York in 1799, so lived a brief life of 32 years. American frontiersman, hunter, trapper, author, cartographer, and explorer of the Rocky Mountains, the North American West, and the Southwest during the early 19th century. Leaving from St. Louis in 1822, he would venture to the Salt Lake frontier and be amongst the first American citizens, his party, to cross to the Colorado River, to cross the Mojave Desert, to California, and then to go from California to Oregon, crossing the Sierra Nevada, the Great Basin Desert, and finding the route from from California to Oregon, also then establishing the 20-mile wide South Pass as the dominant point of crossing the Continental Divide for pioneers in the Oregon Trail. On May 27th, 1831, Smith and his partners had been in the midst of a trading mission to Santa Fe, and while searching for water in present-day southwest Kansas, Smith went missing. It was learned some weeks later that he had been killed during an encounter with the Comanche, and his body never recovered. He'd survived 3 previous Indian massacres and a bear mauling. He was forgotten to history for about 3/4 of a century before, in the early and mid-20th century, a great deal more was discovered about him. The explorer John C. Fremont used Jedediah Smith's maps in his explorations. May 27th, 1836, the birth in Roxbury, New York, of Jason J. Gould, American railroad magnate and financial speculator, identified as one of the robber barons of the Gilded Age. Theodore Roosevelt would actually speak against Gould, and Gould died during Roosevelt's lifetime in 1892 in New York City. In 1869, Gould and his partner Fisk attempted to corner the gold market. They had contacts with President Ulysses S. Grant's secretary, and it caused the great crash of 1869. So Theodore Roosevelt wasn't the only one to complain about the role that Gould played in our economy. Eventually, he would control over 10,000 miles of railway and control about 15% of the country's railway tracks by 1882. Including ownership of the Union Pacific, the Western Union Telegraph Company, and the elevated railways in New York City. And this would have been where Theodore Roosevelt and Gould would have come into significant conflict with one another, as Theodore Roosevelt sought to tax the monopoly of the elevated trains in the city. May 27th, 1837, the birth in present-day Troy Grove, LaSalle, Illinois, of Wild Bill Hickok. I visited the memorial recognizing the birthplace of Hickok. Of course, his gravesite is here in Deadwood at Mount Moriah Cemetery. For Hickok came west, and in 1876 was serving as the sheriff of Deadwood, or I don't believe he was sheriff, but he'd done some law enforcement work. In Deadwood, Dakota Territory, he was shot in the back of the head by Jack McCall. The card players know that his hand, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, are referred to as the dead man's hand. The lawlessness of Deadwood was responded to by the city fathers by hiring one Seth Bullock that same year, 1876, to begin his duties of sheriff of Deadwood, in which capacity he and Theodore Roosevelt would first meet. May 27th, 1905, closer to Theodore Roosevelt's presidency and his impact, the Russo-Japanese War, the two-day battle of Tsushima, or Tsushima Straits. This is the area that goes between Korea and Japan, and it was in that area, sometimes the Japanese call it the Battle of the Sea of Japan, that Admiral Togo defeated and destroyed 2/3 of the Russian fleet, that fleet having come all the way from the Baltic Sea, over 18,000 nautical miles, to try to relieve the Pacific fleet of the Russians at Port Arthur. And in London in 1906, Sir George Clark wrote, "The Battle of Tsushima is by far the greatest and most important naval event since Trafalgar." The Portsmouth Treaty was concluded in September of 1905 without any further major battles in the war. May 27th, 1907, the birth in Springdale, Pennsylvania, of Rachel Louise Carson. Rachel Carson, American marine biologist, author, and conservationist, whose book Silent Spring and other writings are credited with advancing the global environmental movement. got her start with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, and Carson was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Jimmy Carter. She died at the age of 57 in 1964 in Silver Spring, Maryland. May 27th, 1911, the birth in Wallace, South Dakota, of Hubert Horatio Humphrey, Jr., American politician, mayor of Minneapolis, senator from Minnesota, 38th Vice President of the United States, Democratic nominee for the presidency in 1968. And finally, May 27th, 1923, the birth in Fürth, Weimar Republic, of Henry Alfred Kissinger. This may be the first individual on our Teddy Talks with this date in history, or this date in Theodore Roosevelt history. The first individual for whom we would be wishing a happy birthday who's still alive. This would be the 97th birthday for Henry Alfred Kissinger. Born in Germany, but the Secretary of State of the United States under Presidents Nixon and Ford, a national security advisor, credited with our policies of détente with the Soviet Union, the opening up of the relationship, and Nixon's secret visit to the People's Republic of China, engaged in shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East to end the Yom Kippur War, and negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, ending the involvement in the Vietnam War. He's written many books on diplomatic history and international relations, and is certainly not an uncontroversial figure still today in American history. And I spoke a bit too early when I said that was it for this date in history. One last one, if I may, and this comes close to our own lifetimes. And May 27th, 1960. This is a death date in New York City of James Montgomery Flagg, born June 18th, 1877 in Pelham, New York. An American artist, comics artist, and illustrator. In the early 20th century, the highest paid illustrator, as he was the head illustrator for such publications as the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's magazine. Amongst the many images that Flagg gave to us was Uncle Sam, and that poster of the bearded Uncle Sam pointing out from the poster, "I want you to join the United States Army." We posted that at Teddy Talks on Facebook, and you can see that image there. And unfortunately, we had to use that same image again during Flagg's lifetime. It was redone for World War II as well. Well, a bit of an indulgence in this day in history, May 27th. There was a great deal left out, and that brings us, however, to a couple of speeches Theodore Roosevelt made on his Great Western trip in 1903, still in a way establishing his agenda through Congress and through connecting with the American people and the press, having just come to the presidency from the vice presidency in September of 1901. This was Theodore Roosevelt's first chance to go and visit the Western states since his ascendancy to the presidency. His first time to visit the states of Washington and Oregon and California, and the first time to see the Grand Canyon. But he makes quick whistle-stop trips through Montana, Idaho, and Utah on these three subsequent dates. So today, these two briefer speeches from Montana. The first in Butte, Montana. Mr. Chairman, and you, my fellow citizens, it would have been a great pleasure to come to Butte in any event. It is a double pleasure to come here at the invitation of the representatives of the wage workers of Butte. I do not say merely working men, because I hold that every good American who does his duty must be a working man. There are many different kinds of work to do, but so long as the work is honorable, is necessary, and is well done, the man who does it well is entitled to the respect of his fellows. I have come here to this meeting especially as the invited guest of the wage workers, and I am happy to be able to say that the kind of speech I will make to you, I would make just in exactly the same language to any group of employers or any set of our citizens in any corner of this republic. I do not think, so far as I know, that I have ever promised beforehand anything I did not make a strong effort to make good afterward. It is sometimes very attractive and very pleasant to make any kind of a promise without thinking whether or not you can fulfill it. But in the after event, it is always unpleasant when the time for fulfilling comes. For in the long run, the most disagreeable truth is a safer companion than the most pleasant falsehood. Tonight I have come hither, looking on either hand at the results of the enterprises which have made Butte so great. The man who by the use of his capital develops a great mine, the man who by the use of his capital builds a great railroad, the man who by the use of his capital, either individually or joined with others like him, does any great legitimate business enterprise, confers a benefit, not a harm, upon the community, and is entitled to be so regarded. He is entitled to the protection of the law, and in return he is to be required himself to obey the law. The law is no respecter of persons. The law is to be administered neither for the rich man as such, nor for the poor man as such. It is to be administered for every man, rich or poor, if he is an honest and law-abiding citizen, and it is to be invoked against any man, rich or poor, who violates it, without regard to which end of the social scale he may stand at, without regard to whether his offense takes the form of greed and cunning, or the form of physical violence. In either case, if he violates the law is to be invoked against him. And in so invoking it, I have the right to challenge the support of all good citizens, and to demand the acquiescence of every good man. I hope I will have it, but once for all I wish it understood, that even if I do not have it, I shall enforce the law. The soldiers who fought in the great Civil War fought for liberty under, by, and through the law. And they fought to put a stop once and for all to any effort to sunder this country on the lines of sectional hatred. Therefore, their memory shall be forever precious to our people. We need to keep ever in mind that he is the worst enemy of this country who would strive to separate its people along the lines of section against section, of creed against creed, or of class against class. There are two sides to that. It is a base and an infamous thing for the man of means to act in a spirit of arrogant and brutal disregard of right toward his fellow who has less means. And it is no less infamous, no less base, to act in a spirit of rancor, envy, and hatred against the man of greater means, merely because of his greater means. If we are to preserve this republic as it was founded, as it was handed down to us by the men of 61 to 65, and as it is, and will be, we must draw the line never between section and section, never between creed and creed, thrice never between class and class, but along the line of conduct, the line that separates the good citizen, wherever he may be found, from the bad citizen, wherever he may be found. This is not, and never shall be, a government of a plutocracy. It is not, and never shall be, a government by a mob. It is, as it has been, and as it will be, a government in which every honest man, every decent man, be he employer or employed, wage worker, mechanic, banker, lawyer, farmer, be he who he may, if he acts squarely and fairly, if he does his duty by his neighbor and the state, receives the full protection of the law, and is given the amplest chance to exercise the ability that there is within him, alone or in combination with his fellows as he desires. My friends, it is sometimes easier to preach a doctrine under which the millennium will be promised offhand, if you have a particular kind of law, or follow a particular kind of conduct. It is easier, but it is not better. The millennium is not here. It is some 1,000 years off yet. Meanwhile, there must be a good deal of work and struggle, a good deal of injustice. We shall often see the Tower of Siloam fall on the just as well as the unjust. We are bound in honor to try to remedy injustice, but if we are wise, we will seek to remedy it in practical ways. Above all, remember this, that the most unsafe advisor to follow is the man who would advise us to do wrong in order that we may benefit by it. That man is never a safe man to follow. He is always the most dangerous of guides. The man who seeks to persuade any of us that our advantage comes in wronging or oppressing others can be depended upon, if the opportunity comes, to do wrong to us in his own interest, just as he has endeavored to make us in our supposed interest do wrong to others. Those were the remarks at Butte, followed by these at Helena, Montana, by President Theodore Roosevelt, May 27th, 1903. It is a great pleasure to come through this state and to see legibly written for the most unobservant to read assured promise of a future greatness. I sometimes think that you yourselves do not altogether realize how great that future will be. Your mines count for much. Your ranches count for much. But most of all is going to be done by the water, and in two ways. In the first place, thanks to the rapid fall of the rivers from the mountains, there is a well-nigh inexhaustible source of power in your streams, which will certainly be used in the building up of great manufactures. We are going to see great manufacturing centers here in Montana taking advantage of the power of your waters. In the next place, those waters will be used under wise schemes of irrigation until you make this whole state blossom like the rose. You need first of all to distribute the water in space through the irrigating ditches, and then to preserve it in time by storage in reservoirs, so as to keep the floods that run to waste of one season for use at the season when they are most needed. And Congress, the national legislature, has not of recent years put upon the statute books any law as wise, as beneficent as the National Irrigation Act of a year ago. It was the beginning of the scheme of using aright the waters which have been allowed to go to waste. And as all of you know, when irrigation becomes an accomplished fact, and the waters are used in accordance with the right principles of irrigation, we always find that rainfall is a very poor substitute for it. We have passed in irrigation the stage of preliminary experiment. There is no question of what can be done by it. The question merely is to the method, as to the means of making it most effective, and, in my judgment, the greatest development within our borders, the greatest development not on the seacoast of the United States during the next half-century, will be the development of what have been called the arid and semi-arid lands under the applications of the principles of irrigation. And I say one thing with emphasis. In endeavoring to secure the adoption of the irrigation law, I was met with protests from people dwelling in the humid regions who believed that the building up of agriculture in an intensified form in the arid regions through irrigation would be detrimental to them. Seems a rather abrupt end to the comments, but I picture them being done in a series of speeches and things, so that those are the Theodore Roosevelt messages to the people of Montana, May 27th, 1903. Another beautiful day ahead for us in Medora, where the Northern Pacific Railroad crossed the Little Missouri River in 1883, bearing one young Theodore Roosevelt to meet his destiny as a cattle rancher here. We're the benefactors of, we're the beneficiaries of a wonderful gentle rain that fell through the weekend, so that with the warm temperatures and the sunshine, the Badlands are really greening up. They shan't stay green all summer, but they're green now. So come out and enjoy Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which is open to visitors, the Bully Pulpit Golf Course, even just visiting the clubhouse there and looking down upon the Custer's Trail Ranch run by the Eaton brothers, and picturing Custer and the 7th Cavalry on their way out to the Little Bighorn. Well, one is apt to get a bit dreamy when wandering in the Badlands. I hope you'll join us here, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow on Teddy Talks, where Theodore Roosevelt will be bouncing through several communities in Idaho, May 28th, 1903. From Medora and everyone at the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation, goodbye. and good luck.